Warfare is much more than politics. All civilization owe their origin to war making.
Welcome to Historically Speaking. My name is Jayavardhan Singh, and in this podcast, we talk about everything that is history.
War is not a continuation of policy. Now, this is a famous quote by Clausewitz: "Is that war is not." We have this, Clausewitz. I think most of us know who Clausewitz was. So Clausewitz has this famous line that war is the continuation of policy by other means. Now, this notion that Clausewitz has, now what Keegan does is that in the start of the book, he tries to counter this idea. And what I will do is that I will focus on how and what are the various ways through which Keegan has tried to counter this idea that war is not war. As for example, if you study this book, you will find that at the start of the first chapter, the chapter itself start with the line that war is not the continuation of policy by other means. Now, here is a big statement, and in the following pages, what Keegan tries to do is that he tries to understand how, first of all, Clausewitz, when he says that war is a continuation of policy by other means, how he arrived at this conclusion, and then Keegan tries to counter this argument. So basically, I will focus on this whole issue. Now, first of all, who was Clausewitz? We all know that he was a Prussian veteran of the Napoleonic War who wrote one of the most famous books on military thinking, and the book is titled On War. And I think it would not be wrong to say that he is one of the most important modern thinkers, particularly military thinkers. So, first of all, Keegan argues that when we talk about, this idea that war is a continuation of policy by other means. So first of all, the notion which Clausewitz has or had was a little bit more complex. So if you if you not simplify the statement which is made by Clausewitz, it would sound something like this. So I quote: "War is the continuation of political intercourse with the intermixing of other means." So this is how Clausewitz had imagined what war is. But by the time there is this simplification that happened with the translation, and we arrive with this statement that war is a continuation of policy by other means. Now, so this idea of Clausewitz is more subtle. But even here, according to John Keegan, the thought of Clausewitz is not complete, because Keegan argues that when Clausewitz made this statement and what he thought about war. So first of all, Clausewitz made some presumptions. So presumptions. One of the Clausewitz presumptions was that he viewed war as war between states, or for him there is this existence of a state that was necessary, or in the cultural milieu in which Clausewitz lived, this was one of the basic assumptions that one had. And the second was that war was waged because of state interest. And the third was that there was this diplomacy and the culture of diplomacy that was present in the 18th century Europe. So all of this was the presuppositions which Clausewitz made. But Keegan argues that, as we all know, war is certainly older than the emergence of state. Before the arrival of the state, there had been war. So for example, I will quote this line from this book, that warfare is almost as old as man himself, and reaches into the most secret places of human heart. Places where self dissolves rational purpose, where pride reigns, where emotion is paramount, where instinct is king. So, this notion of Clausewitz that war is a continuation of political intercourse, according to John Keegan, has its roots in the in the philosophy of Aristotle. So, I think most of us know about this famous quote of Aristotle that man is a political animal. So, since Clausewitz is a according to Keegan writes that he is a child of Aristotle. So for Clausewitz, a political animal is a war-making animal. So basically the same thing, that war is a continuation of policy by other means. Now Keegan argues there is this two important thing that appears here is that Keegan argues that in the modern world particularly, whenever we think of warfare and war, we think of civilized warfare, and there are two antithetical notions that simultaneously are present when we talk about civilized warfare. So the first is the lawful bearers of arms. So these are the soldiers, and then there are the pacifists. Now what happens in particularly in modern societies is that there is respect for both, and there is also a compromise. Now pacifism is an ideal. So we find that generally it is believed that diplomacy and other means, a war should be avoided. That is the whole notion that we have in modern discourse. But what we find is that when it comes to the lawful bearer of arms, now they one does not want them to be present. That is the ideal. But there is a compromise, because war is a natural phenomena which still continues. So what happens is that there is a strict code of military justice under which these lawful bearer of arms, which are soldiers, they performed, and they exist because there is this practical necessity. So what we see is that when it comes to Clausewitz thinking, so Clausewitz also has this compromise, and that is why he writes that war as the continuation of policy, because ideally, according to Clausewitz, ordered diplomacy and legally binded treaties should be respected by other nations. But sometimes we find that there is also this state interest that one has to deal with, and sometimes it is these self interest or state interest that overrides the ideal, and that is why we see that war happens. So here again we find that when we talk about the society, so society, there are two antithetical notions. First is the lawful bearer of arms, and the second are the pacifist. And here again, when in Clausewitz thinking, the state also operates in these two antithetical notions. So first we have the ideally one should the state should function under order diplomacy, and legally binding treaties should be respected. But there is this also the state interest, and sometimes these state interest come into conflict, and that leads to war. So what happens is that now when we talk about war making, even when there is war, according to Clausewitz, since Clausewitz thinks that it is it's part of the policy. So even when Clausewitz think of war, he is thinking of a particular kind of war. So for example, in Clausewitz presuppositions, we have this notion of siege, pitched battles, skirmishes, raid, etc. And most important for Clausewitz, it is the high level of military discipline and a greater obedience by the subordinate to their lawful superiors. So these are the presuppositions which Clausewitz has when he talks about warfare. Now here what we find is that because of these presuppositions, there's this two view which Clausewitz we find in Clausewitz thinking, and particularly when he deals with Cossacks. So, for example, one on the one hand we have the professional soldiers of the 18th century European states, which should be called or which, according to Keegan, are the lawful bearer of arms, and on the other hand we have the rebels, the freebooters, or the brigands. And what happens here is that even in 18th century, when Clausewitz is writing his books, we see that there is not that these rebels, freebooters, etc. Were completely dealt with. The period of Clausewitz, these irregular soldiers were employed by the professional armies for patrolling, reconnoiter, and skirmishes. And what we also see is that the 18th century also is the period of military development, which saw the expansion of or the inclusion of these type of forces. So, for example, we have in the Russian Empire the inclusion of Cossacks, and then the Highlanders and the Hussars in other European states. So these what we normally call irregulars. So what these irregulars practiced was an older form of warfare. So these included loot, pillage, rape, murder, kidnap, extortion, etc. Whereas for Clausewitz, the new type of warfare was the warfare of the professional soldiers, which involved there is this certain notions of warfare that the different European states acknowledged. So on the one hand we have the old notion of warfare, and on the other hand we have the new notion of warfare. So here, the whole point of all of this was that when Clausewitz is talking about the fact that war is a continuation of politics, his understanding, according to Keegan, is inherently flawed. This approach of Clausewitz is that now this notion of warfare, according to Keegan, is what Clausewitz thinks a war should be, rather than, or according to Keegan, Clausewitz think a war ought to be. So that is why, according to Clausewitz, war ought to be a continuation of policy. But in reality, that was not the case. So when Clausewitz talks about the fact that war is a continuation of policy, he is basically describing the notion of what he thinks a war should be, which, according to Keegan, was not the reality. Reality was completely different. Now, another important point which Keegan argues is that another important general of 19th century, so after Clausewitz, so I think most of us know about William Tecumseh Sherman. He was an important general of in the American Civil War. So according to Keegan, one of the quotes of William Tecumseh Sherman comes much closer to the understanding, or it provides us a more realistic picture of warfare. And this quote, and I quote, is, "I am tired and sick of war. Its glory is all moonshine. War is hell." So what William Tecumseh Sherman is basically arguing is the real nature of war, which, according to Keegan, Clausewitz has some problems with. And also, it's not that Clausewitz did not encounter this aspect of warfare in his life. What happens is that, first of all, there is this important history, is that Clausewitz fought against the French, and he for the Russians. So he was enrolled in the Russian army as a Prussian general, and he fought the French. So what Clausewitz, during when the French were retreating from Moscow, and Clausewitz encountered how the Cossacks pursued the retreating French, and the kind of gory details that and the cruelties which these Cossacks committed greatly haunted him. So there's this quote by Clausewitz, and I will quote it, that if my feeling had not been hardened, it would have sent me mad. Even so, it will take many years before I can recall what I have seen without a shuddering horror. So, even someone like Clausewitz, who had a great experience of warfare, even he, when he saw what Cossacks did to the retreating French, there was this great horror which he experienced. Now, one question which here comes is that why did the Cossack pursuit, which happened during the retreat of the French, so troubled Clausewitz? He was a soldier and he had seen many battles. Then why he was so horrified? So Keegan answers this, and there's this quote which I will quote: "We are hardened by what we know, and we rationalize and even justify cruelties practiced by us and our like, while retaining the capacity to be outraged, even disgusted by practices equally cruel, which under the hands of stranger take a different form." So essentially, what is happening is that the type of warfare which these Cossacks were practicing, and the type of warfare which Clausewitz was aware of, or which he knew, was essentially completely different. And in that sense, we can say that Clausewitz and the Cossacks were strangers, although they both were soldiers and they engaged in warfare. But the kind of warfare these two practiced were essentially different. And there is this quote which Clausewitz has, is that Cossacks were cruel to the weak and the cowardly in the face of the brave, exactly opposite to the pattern of behavior so that which the Prussian officer and gentleman had been schooled to observe. So this is the quote of Keegan. So Keegan argues that the kind of cruelty, especially against the weak and the cowardly, which these Cossacks perpetrated upon, disgusted him. And there's this instance which is reported by a Russian officer during the Crimean War of 1854, during the Battle of Balaclava. So here, there's this important incident when two Cossack regiments were sent to oppose the charge of a British light brigade. Now, when the Cossacks saw the kind of numbers the English had, they just started running. And in order to clear their way of retreat, they started shooting upon the Russian soldiers as well. Now, what happens is that after this, the Russian artillery pounds the English light brigade. And when these English were retreating, so now the Cossacks returns and they started looting. So essentially, what here is happening is that, according to Clausewitz, or what Keegan believes is that Keegan argues that Clausewitz would have viewed these Cossacks not as soldiers, not even as mercenaries, but as scavengers. So essentially, Clausewitz did not think that these Cossacks were even mercenaries, let alone soldiers. Now, the reason for this, the fact that Clausewitz did not consider these Cossacks as soldiers, because the culture in which Clausewitz was raised was completely different from the culture in which these Cossacks were raised. So for the Cossacks and other such peoples, their military culture was essentially very different from the European military culture. And if we have to summarize the culture of the Cossacks and other people, it was basically, it boils down to the fact that live to fight another day. So these Cossacks would never ever try to attack the the stronghold or the strong enemy when they knew that they could not succeed. Now, Clausewitz and other like him, they were their origin, or the origin of their military culture was completely different. They came from a professional officer class of a centralized European state. Thus, in their culture, war not only included so what happens is that because of this background, the kind of warfare which is known to Clausewitz is completely different from the kind of warfare which these Cossacks practiced. Now, here, this is the important point which Keegan is trying to make. So, what Keegan here argues is that now the fact that Cossacks are practicing a different kind of warfare, and Clausewitz is practicing a different kind of warfare, suggests that war not only included politics but culture as well. So this important notion that war essentially involves culture does not find any mention in Clausewitz. So this is the whole point of the fact that the fact that Cossacks had a different kind of warfare suggests that war does not necessarily mean that it is the continuation of policy by other means. There are many other things that are involved in warfare that one should keep in mind. Now, so this is the basic argument of Keegan. Now, another important point which Keegan tries to explain is the culture in which Clausewitz, has, or the military culture which Clausewitz had experienced. Now, the culture which Clausewitz has experienced was a regimental culture, and particularly, we all know that Clausewitz was a regimental officer. And what is a regiment? We all know that a regiment is roughly 1,000 strong. Strong soldiers are basically a regiment. So, by the time of Clausewitz, so we are talking about 18th century Europe, regiment was an established feature of the European military landscape. But this important development in military landscape was not that recent, was not that old. We find that in the 17th century, when this regimental system was introduced, it was a revolutionary feature of military warfare, and as revolutionary, according to Keegan, as, let's say, autonomous bureaucracy. So let's first briefly understand this emergence of regiment and why these regiments are so important. So traditionally, we all know that during the Middle Ages, Europe was a feudal society. So king was dependent upon the feudal landlords to raise army, and in lieu of their service, the feudal landlords were granted land, and they had great authority over the people of that land, and also they own most of the land there. Now, this feudal system was not very efficient, which we all know. Basically, these feudal lords, sometimes they declined to raise armies, and or in some cases we find that they tried to become independent or to become king themselves, and sometimes they used to fight with each other, and sometimes with the king as well. So because of all this system of this feudal system was not that efficient, and in some cases we find that the kings of this 15th century Europe or 14th century Europe, what they used to do was that when they needed soldiers and the feudal armies was not enough, they tried to recruit mercenaries as well. Now, the employment of mercenaries created a problem, and this was the problem of unpaid mercenaries. So sometimes the great number of mercenaries were included in army, and when the war is over, the king finds that he has not enough money to pay these mercenaries. And in the mid 15th century Europe, we find that the menace of unpaid mercenaries had become a great sense of worry. And the kind of problem, or the kind of violence these unpaid mercenaries exacted upon the peasant and other sections of European society can be compared from the fact that they were they were compared with Vikings, Magyars, or the Saracens or the Muslims, for example. So this was the menace of unpaid mercenaries. And what we see is that to combat this problem of unpaid mercenaries, what kings used to do was that they used to employ more mercenary soldiers. Now, after employing these mercenary soldiers, some kings would find that they did not have enough money to pay. Then again, this whole process repeats. So this had become a circular problem. Now, an important development happened in mid 15th century France. And France was the place where this development happened, because France was the country which was majorly affected by this phenomena of unpaid mercenaries. And we find that what happened was that the French king Charles VII, what he did was that he formed in the year 1445 to 1446, he formed mercenary companies with a uniform composition. So now what he did was that he recognized some of the mercenaries as official military servant of the monarchy. And to some extent, this created a permanent army. Now, this development had a great impact on the military culture of Europe itself. And what we also see is that this was also the period when the infantry is becoming superior to the cavalry. So we all know that in the feudal system, these feudal lords they formed the cavalry arm of the state, of the military. But what we find is that by the time of mid 15th century, because of the coming of effective handguns, this supremacy of cavalry was challenged by the infantry. And cavalry not only suffered greatly with the coming of handguns, but we also see that with the introduction of gunpowder, what happened was that earlier, when a feudal lord revolted, he had this belief that his castle, which was defended properly, would be a great place for him to protect himself. Now, because of the gunpowder, we find that now the state, particularly the monarchy, could enforce their authority over these feudal lords. And particularly by, suppose, let's say a feudal lord revolts and he shuts himself in his castle. Now, because of the fact that now there is this great advancement in gunpowder and particularly mobile artillery, this meant that now the sovereign could employ this mobile artillery in the siege of the castle. And this meant that now the feudal lords did not have enough authority of their own. So all of these phenomena meant that by the time of 1600s, the role of these feudal lords, particularly, they were now commanding the regiments. Initially the regiments were raised in order to combat the monopoly of soldiers that the feudal lords had. But by the time of 17th century, we see that first of all the power of the feudal lords had greatly diminished, and because of this, now the regiments are being are commanded by these feudal lords. And they were appointed at this position by the royal favor. So this is also shows that how from the 15th century to the 17th century, the power of the monarchy in Europe, how greatly it has increased. So, and in this expansion of the power of monarchy, one of the important uh, uh, role which was role was also played by this regiments and in infantry, particularly that was not dependent upon the feudal lords. So thus what we see is that basically the regiment is gradually became a national institution. So what does that mean? So by regiment becoming a national institution, we basically means is that now by the time of 17th late 17th century, we find that in European towns, particular regiments had a fixed headquarter, which in most cases was a provincial city. And what used to happen was that this regiment, suppose it is located in a particular town, it would recruit its soldiers from the nearby area. And then what we find is that the officer of this regiment also came from a certain section of society. So because of all this, the regiment itself acquired a character of a national institution. And if we look at the example of Clausewitz, we find that Clausewitz also came from such a regiment. So Clausewitz came, his regiment was the Prussian 34th Infantry Regiment, and interestingly, he joined this regiment at the age of 11. And when we talk about I have just mentioned that this regiments of this period were stationed in a particular town. So this regiment of Clausewitz was stationed in the town of Neuruppin, which is a Brandenburg town, which it doesn't matter, but it shows you that how important regiments had become. And by the time of 19th century, we see that these garrison towns were spread all over the Europe. So every nation had many of these garrison towns. And what also happened in these regiments is that the soldiers of these regiments were virtually enslaved, and they were effectively prisoned in the garrison towns because they could not roam around anywhere. But this also meant that these regiments also developed a culture of their own, and they also had their own rules, rituals, and discipline. And it is from this kind of background we find that Clausewitz had come. So when he talks about the fact that these Cossacks are waging a war, which he does not first of all recognize these Cossacks as soldiers. So we should keep in mind that in the background we have this long development of military tradition that happened in Europe. So this was the culture from which Clausewitz has come. Whereas the culture of the Cossack soldiers was entirely different. Now here it is an important notion which Clausewitz introduces, and this is the notion of real war and true war. So Clausewitz argues that the culture of Cossacks favored, Clausewitz argue here. Keegan is arguing. So Keegan argues that the culture of the Cossacks favored real war. So what is a real war? So real war is a war which is much closer to the nature. It is fought for the self-interest, where man fought when he chose to. So basically here in the real war, it is the self-interest which reigns supreme. Now compare this to the true war. So what is true war? True war, on the other hand, was embodied by the regiment culture. So true war is the culture of the European regiments, or the culture of Clausewitz, or Clausewitz military culture. So this culture encourages total obedience, single-minded courage, self-sacrifice, honor. So these are the requirements of true war. Now this kind of features was not present in the Cossack soldiers, and that is why when Clausewitz thinks that these Cossacks are not soldiers, he is basically thinking that a soldier should have these features. And for Clausewitz, a profession when he talks about professional soldiers, he is thinking about a person who wages true war, not real war. So this we have to keep in mind. Now, interestingly, we find that Clausewitz was present in a period which saw great warfare, and particularly we are talking about the warfare that happened after the French Revolution. So, the revolutionary French armies, uh, they they won great victories, and according to Clausewitz, one of the reasons which led to the victory of these French revolutionary armies was the fact that these French soldiers, they practiced true warfare. So basically, the fact that uh, and these soldiers of the French revolutionary armies, they had total obedience, single-minded courage, self-sacrifice, honor. This made them much more effective compared to, let's say, the Prussian or other European soldiers. And one of the reasons why why the French revolutionary armies were able to wage this true warfare was because of the politics of the revolutionary France. So we all know that one of the main culture or main idea of the revolution, the French Revolution, was equality of citizens. So these French revolutionary soldiers were they had this great what we can say uh, politics or inspiration of that they are equal citizens and all that. Now, for Clausewitz, one of the most interesting or important problem that he wanted to solve was the fact that how can he have this form of warfare, that is the true war, so practiced by the armies of the French Republic and even by the Napoleonic soldiers, without the politics of revolution. So basically, what Clausewitz was thinking is that he wanted the Prussian soldiers to fight like the French revolutionary soldiers, but he did not want the politics of the French Revolution coming into Prussia. So, in other words, so basically, he wanted the Prussian soldier to fight like the soldier of revolutionary French soldiers, but while remaining politically innocent. And there is this quote of Clausewitz, which is that fight as if the fire of politics flowed in his vein. So he should fight like that, but it should not happen that politics should flow in his vein. So this was the whole problem which Clausewitz tried to address in his book. Now, the task of Clausewitz was quite different. So this notion that, so for Clausewitz, he want to answer this question, but his task was difficult because he had to convince a type of institution that hated the idea of politics. So for the Prussian army of this period, politics was a anathema. And what happens was that the solution which Clausewitz comes up with is is to a certain extent is, according to Keegan, is the solution which Marx came when he talks about the workers. So basically, Clausewitz believe that to convince the society that the true war, so what Clausewitz here argues is that Clausewitz thinks that if a state wants to wage war at a better scale or more efficiently, he has to wage a true war. And it is this true war that can make a nation more successful in waging war, and it can also leads to achieving all of the goals that is desired by a particular nation. Now, one of the important points which Clausewitz argues when we talk about his solution is that if the soldiers will think of themselves as belonging to a kind of guild, so basically a regiment, this guild, through its custom and law, will give proper place to the spirit of war, then it is this spirit that will make the regiment successful. So basically, what Clausewitz here is arguing is that by raising the military culture of a particular regiment, we can have soldiers practicing true warfare. And according to Keegan, the World War I was the great example of true war. And the instance, so what happens is that, according to Keegan here, I think, makes a very important point here. So he argues that the insistence of Clausewitz that the true war is the most successful way for the nation to achieve success was one of the ideologies of World War I. And what happened was that one of the features of true war was that, so we all know that what are the features of true war? The features of true war are total obedience, single-minded courage, self-sacrifice, honor. So it was all of these features of true war that the nations that fought World War I, what happened was that because they are waging this true war where all of these good qualities resides, this led to the great violence or great killings that we see in World War II. So basically, if suppose the World War I, this notion of true war did not existed, we would have found that the kind of killing that happened would not have happened, according to Keegan. So basically, the ideology of World War I, Keegan argues, was the ideology of Clausewitz. So I think here one of the important point which Keegan has made is basically when he argues about warfare, is that he believes that warfare does not necessarily means that we are talking about politics. Instead, warfare is much more than politics. It is culture, and there are other many things. And one of the important point of the book itself is there's this one premise which this book has, is that all civilization owe their origin to war making. And one of the quotes I will end this talk with is of Keegan, which I will end this talk. And the quote goes like this: all civilization owe their origin to the warrior. Their culture nurture the warrior who defend them, and the difference between them will make those of one very different in externals from those of another.